So today we're talking about thought patterns, what they are, how to use them, and how to understand them in a more profound way. So to start off, thought patterns are like the vehicles of reasoning. Reasoning is how ideas relate to each other. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 keys to help you create better thought patterns. But before we get into it, it's very important that we have proper starting points. So the main thing I want you to know and understand is knowledge. We get knowledge from sensory perception, the 5 senses, and we conceptualize the information with the 6th sense, aka a thought. In order for me to know what has happened around me, I have to know what that thing is or have an idea about what that thing is. If not, where am I? Lostness. Don't know what it is, where to go to, how to put that thing together to have a structured reality, aka a beautiful piece of information that I know that I can create from. That's what we're here to do. But that's what I was saying. When we understand that in itself, we understand the modal of the thought that will correspond to your spirit, the space that you're in. So, for an example, if I'm in an environment and I hear something fall and I don't know what that sound sounds like to me, aka that sound is not familiar, then my mind will start to conceptualize skepticism, how I treat skepticism. Understand, there's only certain amounts of energies that we are constantly doing, definitely within this world. So you got to understand the human mind, it's not that deep. It's you creating forms and figures and shapes, and you not knowing where these forms, figures, shapes, symbols, signs are corresponding to as information. So whenever you see how things are lining up, how context is playing out via mental or physical event, and how you're participating via reaction, and how you're reacting and responding to your thoughts, ideas, feelings, emotions. Like all these things are key factors. The brain does not stop. I'm sorry, the mind does not stop. So we gotta really, really understand what we are doing. And the brain is how the sensory perception is being picked up. So what we know about our senses, how we perceive the environment. So back to my example, if I'm in a space, a environment, a arena where a sound is foreign to me, my mind will conceptualize how I look at foreign things, foreign objects within that setting, within that environment. Everything plays a key factor. This is how you're creating thought forms, a thought and a feeling to act as like a shortcut. So next time you're in a similar space environment and you hear a sound like that, your mind will use that as an idea to correspond to what you are experiencing or what you think you are experiencing. But if I'm in a space, a environment, and I hear something drop and I don't know that sound, then my mind gives me an idea about what that sound is. If I was to observe what fell, my mind would then not give me an idea. That's when I will start to create. I will start to have an idea about what that thing is based on what that thing means to me. So, for an example, let's say I'm an artist and I hear a coin fall and I see a coin fall. The way that coin fell, where it landed, how it landed, I can grab an idea about that and I can put it in the painting. So we got to really understand whenever we are experiencing reality and we see it with the eyes, our mind does not need to conceptualize the information because it knows what that is based on how you identify that symbol with your current life, how you're looking at that nature, or how that nature responded, reacted to its environment, and it probably gave you a creative idea. So this is what the mind is doing. It's either you're either in a form of skepticism, curiosity, or you're having creative ideas about what it is that is around you. And if you don't know how to transmute it, then what you do is get lost within the form, the nature of what the idea is representing to you to help you understand the arena that you're in. When I say space, this is what space is. Space is the environment of where thoughts and feelings get manifested from. So we gotta really, really, really understand that in the arena, the environment, corresponds to the intention of the individual. Because this is very important. You need to understand knowledge. This is how we get knowledge, because you don't want to get lost in fallacious information by way of the mind. Because you have fallacious beliefs from mistaken reality based on feelings and things of that nature. Because that's how fallacious information, that fallacious mindset within your head, that mindset that's not always right, but it may sound right. So your relationship with that is it's a teeter totter. So you got to really understand. This is very important. This is how information is relating to particular natures, personas, archetypes within you by ways of means. So we got to really understand knowledge. Very important. Now we can get into the three key concepts of what it takes to be aware of thought patterns and to creating better thought patterns. The first one, virtue. Second, reason. And third, identity. We're going to start off with virtue. This is how we're going to discover our purpose. More principles encapsulate reasoning and purpose. When we act in virtue, we're creating an environment that opposes the behaviors of past events, past thoughts, past feelings. Right? Like I just said, whenever you're in a space, so a persona or archetype that was manifested from a external event, aka you experiencing the five senses, and your mind conceptualized that environment, that space, that place, and the place within you, how you're observing it and how you act and respond. That is what creates a character within your mind. That is what creates an archetype within your mind. That is how you look at that archetype, and your relationship with that archetype is how you grab a piece of that to bring back to your ego per se, and you make a persona around that based on your intention with that piece particular, that 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 property of that object as being that character, that ego. So this is very important, because with virtue we can sit on the throne, because this is what encapsulates reasoning and purpose. When we act in virtue, we're creating an environment that opposes everything that goes against the old energies that you wasn't being virtuous in. So you're making decisions that were not rational. That was out of fear, out of worry. Okay, those are characters. So whenever you go back to that space based on a external event getting sparked, then hey, a thought, the first thought of that you will dive into by way of you not knowing this is what I created, this is how I react and respond, and this is my relationship to this individual property. Property is being like a trait, like an urge, okay? Like your mind gets super duper looper deep. Like y'all gotta understand this. And wherever you are as a spirit, your perspective, your knowing about life, your knowing about your mind, this is what the theme around your story is going to be by way of imagination and emotions. So the novelty of imagination, what these symbols and objects are within your imagination, and how you act and respond to them, relationship with these objects, these particulars, these traits, these urges, values, pleasures, passions. You treat certain individual things as being natures, energies, differently. You have different things associated with them. So your mind knows this. You don't know this. This is why you get lost. And this is what grants a human the ability to even create a Bible, to create hieroglyphics, to create gods and deities, or to have an idea about a god and deity and things of that nature. So you got to really understand, man and woman are just humans with brains. Anything on this planet has been the same. It's been the same. That's just some free game. Y'all are lost within everything of the world. But whenever we understand virtue, this is what helps us get back in our square, our own individual square. Not be squaring out within a circle full of other thoughts and feelings that don't belong to us. We're going to use the four cardinal virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. The reason why we act in virtue is because, like I stated, whenever you go to a nature of, let's say, temperance, whenever you act in temperance, you're acting with intention and purpose because you overindulge with something. So whenever that overindulgent thought comes in play, you take the ride within that, and what you manifest, the thoughts and feelings that you get while on that, the archetypes, the people that you come across on that ride that you gotta meet, that you have to shake hands with, esoterically speaking, archetypes, the shadow, your ego, first thoughts and ideas from an ego, first thoughts and ideas from a shadow, from things that you don't like, things of that nature. Like, this is why we experience this. Like, your mind is a world, buddy. So whenever you go and practice within different natures of natural law, that's when you get into better energies. So whenever we act in temperance, we're producing thoughts and feelings that correspond to us having discipline. So whenever we go back to that space of having indulgent thoughts, greed, and things of that nature, we're going to see that shooting star, and that's going to remind us that, hey, this is the energy where I hop into overindulgent thoughts, and that leads me down another journey that I'm not aware of. That's where I make decisions. That's where I focus my logic, and I start to produce fallacious belief systems based on me mistaking where I am because I made a decision that went against what my purpose or intention of being alive is, doing something. So this is very important. This is why virtue is very important. It's going to help us stay firm within our square, shaping out our circle. So this is how we understand arena, where thoughts and feelings get derived from, and our values, what thoughts and feelings are using to symbolize, represent, and resemble our souls. So we gotta really understand. So we gotta really understand this to point out the reprobate garbage and understand the mental affairs that you have within your mind, so we can get right into what I'm gonna get into next, reasoning. But before we get into reasoning, let's recap. To create the foundation we need to spot the important things, such as traits, skills, gifts, talents, and our values. So we can use the four cardinal virtues to help us do that. Another one would be understanding and recognizing ideas and the characters that are associated with those ideas and the polar opposite of that particular nature, of that trait, urge, or habit. Now, get into reasoning. This is another key. Reasoning is how ideas are relating to each other. So this is the perspective or your desires. To have an idea about something and to apply it is to fulfill a desire. So this determines how you ride whenever you're in a thought pattern, whenever you're experiencing different ideas and different thoughts, different feelings down a line of reasoning, down a train of thought. Reasoning is how you're going to ride it. Okay. So a thought pattern is basically reasoning, you riding with reasoning. And the shapes and forms, the relationship that you have with these ideas and thoughts and feelings, that is determined with virtue. That's how virtue and reasoning are together. But you got to understand, virtue is another form of reasoning. That's why I stated virtue is the most important one. But back to what I was saying, this is how you're going to ride within the thought pattern. To broaden this out, I'm going to give you an example. If I have a goal to get rich, a purpose to get rich, and my reason for it is to impress other people, then I would have to prepare for the polar opposite of that trait. Okay, so the things that resemble that reasoning as being I want to impress other people. So I was saying about the environment, the arena. If I don't have virtue, then I will be lost within the forms of where my mind is about to get me while going down that path. So if I see no progress or feel like there's no progress towards making money, then everywhere that I see as a representation of money, my mind will manifest thoughts within the shadows of failure, because that's how I perceive myself to be. So that's the space. So if I'm not aware of what I just created, then that is what's about to manifest within thoughts and feelings. And I'm going to use those thoughts and feelings as a form to justify my behavior. So this is where you fall within consciousness, you fall within your mind. Why? Because virtue. This is why virtue is the most important one, buddy. So we gotta really understand this is what you're doing. And that's how the theme of your mind is created. This is how you're creating a story. Like I said earlier, this is how a human gets the idea to create a Bible and things of that nature. We can only create whenever we're at this space right now, because we have all this knowledge, all this creative ability that God just gave us. So we gotta really understand, man and woman, like I said earlier, are humans with brains like you. You can't forget it. You can't forget it. Don't forget it. Let's say I flip it. It's vice versa. Even though we can morally judge about that person, so that identity, that character that wants to do things to get approval and praise from other people, we can morally judge that character. We can bash or look at that character in the way we want to. But if I was to switch it out, meaning if I was to look at myself obtaining money and things of that nature, then my mind will produce thoughts and feelings of the opposite. So this is what understanding the polar opposites is for. And this is where majority of humanity is putting their energy towards whenever they're trying to manifest their dream reality. Timeline jump, timeline shift, whatever words y'all be using. So understand this is what reasoning is. This is how we ride. Okay. Now, to recap about reasoning, so you can have the proper understanding about reasoning. Reasoning is the relationship between ideas. So, for an example, how you look at your passions, pleasures, desires, how the ideas use those forms to represent and to give you a form of knowing, a form of knowledge. That's why knowledge is important, because without you understanding knowledge, you're not going to be able to organize information like your perception does. Because if you don't study your perception, and then you won't know how to organize information and construct information. You will have your own way by way of fallacious thought, fallacious ideas. Okay. Also, this is the mind's eye. This is the seat of intellect, reasoning. Now, the final one we're going to touch on is identity. Identity is very important too, because this is how we're going to identify what that character, what that trait is, what that persona, what that archetype is. Okay, because you can't identify nothing. And this is why the first thought is very important, because the first thought helps us understand the nature of the environment that we're in. So if we do not participate within that by way of natural selection, then you're automatically creating the war to go against that first thought. So if you're not aware of that, you're going to be in the midst of war, of thoughts and feelings. And whenever you're in the midst of war, you're also creating another feeling, because whenever you're in the energy of war, you perceive it to be something that's negative, something that's bad. So this is you creating what we can call a hell, something that's chaotic, etc., etc., etc. This is how we understand identity, and to be able to point to where we are, or what that thing is, what that idea is, what that feeling is. Okay, this all corresponds to really back to what I was saying, virtue. But this is more so what happens whenever you break down and the leaf fall from the tree. You start to identify what's falling, how things are falling, what that is, what type of leaf that is, where that leaf belongs to, aka what type of tree that goes to, how that tree sprouts up, how big that tree is, etc. It gets super, super, super duper looper deep. I told y'all this. I told y'all this. So we gotta really understand identity is how we're going to identify that trait, where that trait is, where that trait came from. So we can look at what we're doing within each moment to see how we're actually treating it. So we don't be caught between the lines of a fallacy. That's how it's going to play out, because in one aspect you're not participating within it. But another aspect you are, because you don't understand it's the same energy, it's a different figure, different form. That's why knowledge is important, because if you don't understand knowledge, you don't understand how context, how the story is being played out to get the actual context. So you can understand where you are within your story. So this is all very, very important um, to identify. This is what we're doing. Identity, nothingness, experiencing the first thought, expressing the first thought. So if you don't express the first thought, what happens? Or if you do express the first thought, you get salvation, you get remembrance. You see that shooting star. The angel comes back to you, aka how you was in that energy of temperance, of a virtue. Okay, and that first thought and feeling from that, it reminds you of that. Oh, this is what I'm doing whenever I'm here, and that's why that happens over there. Oh, okay, thank you, God. Okay, thank you, universe. Okay, thank you, angel. Thank you, archangel. Whatever word you using, dude. I don't like. You gotta understand. Human is man, woman with a brain. Like who? Like who? You. So to recap on identity, this is characters and personas and how they're related to each other and how they occur or how a sequence event is playing out with them. So, for an example, this would be the ego, the shadow self, the lower self, your higher self, things of that nature. And confirmation of identity will be with realization, which is an art in itself, which is why I use the term salvation. Okay, so whenever we understand this is what we're doing, we all have brains and understand what's happening around us without words, then life will be way more joyous. So if you watch to the end, I appreciate it. Like, comment, subscribe.